last Apache woman on the auction block, until a stranger paid to set her free. The rope burned against her wrists as Nayland stood on the wooden platform in the center of Dustfield's town square. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, while dozens of eyes stared at her like she was livestock. She kept her chin high, refusing to give these men the satisfaction of seeing her fear. The auctioneer, a fat man named Harold Grimes, grabbed her arm and turned her around slowly, displaying her to the crowd like a prize mare. Nayland's people were gone. The soldiers had come 3 months ago, rounding up her tribe and forcing them onto trains heading east. She had been hunting in the mountains when it happened, and when she returned to find her village burned and empty, she knew she was alone. For weeks she survived in the wilderness, but hunger eventually drove her into town. The marshal arrested her within an hour, claiming she was a vagrant and a threat. Now she was being sold to pay for her own imprisonment. The bidding started at $20. A rancher named Carl Dixon raised his hand first, his tobacco-stained smile making her stomach turn. She had seen men like him before, men who saw Apache women as property to be used and discarded. The price climbed slowly. $30. $40. Each bid felt like another chain wrapping around her soul. She scanned the crowd, looking for any face that might show mercy, but found only greed and curiosity. Then she saw him. A tall stranger stood at the back of the crowd, wearing a dusty black coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his face. Unlike the others who leered and whispered, he stood perfectly still, watching the auction with an expression she could not read. Something about him felt different, though she could not explain why. The bidding reached $60. Carl Dixon seemed determined to win, matching every competing offer with aggressive speed. Harold Grimes grinned wider with each increase, already counting his commission. Nayland felt her last hope fading. She would rather die than become Dixon's property, and she began calculating how quickly she could reach the knife on the marshal's belt if she moved fast enough. Then the stranger spoke. His voice cut through the crowd like a blade, deep and steady. $100. The square went silent. People turned to stare at this newcomer who had just offered more than twice the current bid. Carl Dixon's face turned red with anger, but when he looked at the stranger, something made him step back. He did not raise his hand again. Harold Grimes stammered, clearly shocked by the unexpected windfall. He called for any higher bids, but the crowd remained quiet. The stranger walked forward, his boots hitting the dirt with measured steps. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat and counted out the money in crisp bills, placing them in the auctioneer's sweaty palm without a word. The marshal removed the ropes from Nayland's wrists. Her skin was raw and bleeding where the fibers had cut into her flesh. She studied the stranger as he approached the platform, trying to understand his intentions. His face was weathered and scarred, the face of a man who had seen violence and survived it. His eyes were gray, hard as granite, but they did not look at her with the hunger she had seen in other men. He extended his hand to help her down from the platform. She hesitated, then took it. His grip was firm but not painful. When her feet touched the ground, she expected him to bind her wrists again or announce his ownership, but he did neither. Instead, he looked directly at her and spoke in a low voice that only she could hear. "You are free to go." The words seemed impossible. She stared at him, searching for deception, but found only sincerity. He released her hand and stepped back, giving her space. The crowd watched in confusion as she stood there, uncertain whether this was another cruel trick. The stranger turned and began walking toward a black horse tied near the general store, clearly expecting nothing from her in return. Nayland looked around the square. These people had applauded while she was sold like cattle. They would kill her or imprison her again if she stayed. But where could she go? Her tribe was gone, scattered across a country that wanted her people erased. She was the last Apache woman in this territory, alone in a world that had no place for her. She made her decision quickly. She ran after the stranger, her footsteps light on the packed dirt. He had just reached his horse when she caught up to him. He turned, one eyebrow raised in question. She met his gaze with determination burning in her dark eyes. "I will not run. I will ride with you." The stranger studied her face for a long moment, then gave a single nod. He swung onto his horse and extended his hand once more. She took it, and he pulled her up behind him. As they rode out of Dustfield, Nayland glanced back at the town square one final time. Harold Grimes stood counting his money, while Carl Dixon glared with murderous rage. She turned away from them, facing forward into the unknown territory ahead. Whatever awaited her with this mysterious stranger, it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. The stranger rode hard for 3 hours before finally slowing his horse near a rocky outcrop that offered shade and concealment. Nalin had remained silent during the ride, her arms wrapped around his waist to keep from falling as the horse galloped across the desert terrain. Her body ached from days of imprisonment in the rough journey, but she refused to complain. She had survived worse, and she would not show weakness now. He dismounted first and helped her down with the same careful courtesy he had shown at the auction. Up close she could see more details about him. A scar ran from his left ear to his jaw, pale against his sun-darkened skin. His clothes were well made but worn, the attire of a man who spent more time in the saddle than in town. 2 revolvers hung at his hips, the leather holsters shaped perfectly to the weapons from years of use. He moved like a predator, every motion controlled and purposeful. The stranger pulled supplies from his saddlebags without speaking. He handed her a canteen and she drank deeply, the water washing away the dust that had coated her throat. He produced jerky and hardtack, simple trail food but more than she had eaten in days. They sat in the shade of the rocks, eating in silence while his horse grazed on the sparse desert grass nearby. Finally he spoke. "My name is Jacob Kane." She nodded, swallowing her mouthful of jerky before responding. "I am Nalin. It means maiden in my language." Jacob studied her with those granite eyes. "You were hunting when the soldiers came." It was not a question. Somehow he had deduced the truth from looking at her. She confirmed it with a small nod, impressed by his perception. "They took everyone east. My mother, my sisters, my cousins, all gone to the reservation lands where they will be broken and remade into something they are not." Bitterness crept into her voice despite her attempt to remain stoic. Jacob listened without interrupting, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for several moments before responding. "I have seen what they do on those reservations. It is a slow death, maybe worse than a fast one." Nalin appreciated his honesty. Most white men tried to justify the displacement with talk of civilization and progress, pretty words that meant nothing. Jacob offered no such comfort, and she respected him for it. "Why did you free me?" The question had burned in her mind since the auction. Men did not spend $100 on strangers without reason. Jacob pulled his hat off and ran a hand through his dark hair, streaked with gray at the temples. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of old pain. 15 years ago, I wore a different uniform. I was a soldier, following orders, doing what I was told was necessary to tame this land. We raided a Cheyenne village in the winter. The chiefs had already surrendered, but my commander wanted to make an example. He paused, his jaw tightening. I watched children freeze to death. I watched women shot down as they ran. I did nothing to stop it because I was a coward who believed orders mattered more than conscience. Nalin felt a chill despite the desert heat. She had heard stories of such massacres from her elders. Sand Creek, Washita River, Maria's River, names that carried the weight of innocent blood. Jacob continued, his voice rough with self-loathing that had festered for over a decade. I left the army that night, deserted in the darkness and never looked back. They posted bounties, sent hunters after me, but I disappeared into the territories where law meant nothing. I have spent every year since trying to balance the scales, knowing they will never truly balance. When I saw you on that platform, I saw those Cheyenne women again. I could not walk away a second time. His confession hung in the air between them. Nalin understood now. This was not kindness or attraction. This was penance, the desperate act of a man trying to outrun his own ghosts. Part of her wanted to hate him for what he represented, for the uniform he once wore and the crimes he admitted to committing through inaction. But she had learned long ago that hate was a heavy burden, and she carried enough already. You cannot save the dead by helping the living. Her words were blunt but not cruel. Jacob met her eyes and nodded slowly. I know, but I have to try. They sat in silence again. 2 survivors of different tragedies bound together by circumstance and chance. The sun continued its arc across the sky, indifferent to human suffering below. As evening approached, Jacob began preparing a small fire. Nalin gathered dry brush and dead cactus, her movements efficient from years of practice. They worked together without needing to discuss the tasks, falling into an easy rhythm. When the fire crackled to life, casting dancing shadows on the rocks around them, Jacob pulled out coffee and a battered pot. "Where will you go?" He asked the question while measuring coffee grounds into the pot. Nalin considered her options, which were painfully few. She could try to reach the reservation where her people had been taken, but that meant walking into a prison. She could attempt to survive alone in the wilderness, but winter was coming and solitary survival grew harder each year as more settlers claimed the land. Or she could stay with this strange, haunted man who had purchased her freedom for reasons she was only beginning to understand. I do not know. The admission felt like defeat, but it was honest. Jacob poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. The bitter liquid warmed her from the inside, chasing away the chill that came with the desert night. He stared into the fire, seemingly wrestling with some internal debate before finally speaking again. I have a place. A cabin in the mountains, 3 days' ride north, remote enough that nobody bothers me. You could stay there until you decide what you want to do. No obligations, no expectations. Just a roof and walls until you are ready to move on. The offer was delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything, but Nolan detected the slight hesitation before he spoke. This was not something he did often, opening his sanctuary to strangers. She studied his profile in the firelight. Jacob Kane was a complicated man, carrying guilt that would never fully heal, but using it to drive him towards something better than what he had been. He could have ridden away from that auction and left her to whatever fate awaited. Instead, he had spent a significant amount of money and now offered her shelter with nothing asked in return. Trust did not come easily to Nolan, especially trust in white men, but she found herself believing his sincerity. I will come with you to this cabin, but I will not be a burden. I can hunt, I can work, I can earn my keep. Jacob shook his head firmly. You do not need to earn anything. You are not my servant or my property. You are a free woman who I am offering help to, nothing more. The distinction mattered to him, she could tell. He needed her to understand that this was not another form of ownership disguised as kindness. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence. Jacob produced bedrolls and gave her one along with a blanket. He positioned himself between her and the open desert, a protective stance that spoke of ingrained habits. Before she lay down, Nolan had one more question. What if they come looking for you? Carl Dixon looked ready to kill at that auction. A thin smile crossed Jacob's scarred face, the expression holding no humor. Let them come. I have dealt with angry men before. He patted one of his revolvers. I am still here, and they are not. The cold certainty in his voice told her that this was not empty bravado. Jacob Kane had killed before and would do so again if necessary. Nolan wrapped herself in the blanket and lay down near the fire. The rocks beneath her were hard, but she had slept on worse. She watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, the same stars her ancestors had navigated by for generations. Her people believed that the spirits of the dead became stars, watching over those who remained below. She wondered if her mother could see her now, if the spirits approved of her choice to trust this stranger. Sleep came slowly despite her exhaustion. Her mind replayed the events of the day, from the humiliation of the auction block to the unexpected freedom that followed. She thought about Jacob's confession, about the violence and regret that shaped him. They were both haunted by different ghosts, both trying to survive in a world that had taken everything from them. Perhaps that shared understanding was enough to build something new upon. When she finally drifted off, Nolan dreamed of her village before the soldiers came. She saw her mother weaving baskets, her younger sister laughing as she chased rabbits, her grandmother telling stories by the fire. In the dream, she tried to warn them about what was coming, but no sound came from her mouth. She could only watch as the blue uniformed soldiers appeared on the horizon, knowing she was powerless to change what had already happened. She woke before dawn to find Jacob already up, checking his weapons and saddle with methodical precision. He noticed her stirring and offered her more jerky and water for breakfast. The coffee pot sat ready near the rekindled fire. They ate quickly, both understanding that staying in one place too long invited danger. Jacob wanted to put more distance between them and Dustfield before anyone decided to follow. As they prepared to ride, Nayland noticed Jacob studying the horizon with narrowed eyes. She followed his gaze but saw nothing except empty desert and distant mountains. What is it? She kept her voice low, sensing his tension. He continued scanning for another moment before answering. Dust cloud, about 2 miles back. Could be nothing, could be riders. Either way, we should move. He helped her mount behind him and they set off at a steady pace. Fast enough to cover ground, but not so fast as to exhaust the horse. Nayland glanced back periodically, watching for signs of pursuit. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace. Heat shimmered off the sand and rocks, creating mirages that danced at the edge of vision. Jacob guided his horse with expert skill, choosing paths that offered the best footing and occasional shade. He clearly knew this territory well, navigating by landmarks invisible to Nayland's untrained eye. They stopped briefly at midday to rest the horse and drink from a small spring Jacob knew about. The water was cool and clear, fed by underground sources that had sustained travelers for centuries. While the horse drank its fill, Jacob refilled their canteens and checked their back trail again. His frown deepened. They are still coming. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving faster than casual travelers would. Nolan felt her stomach tighten. She had no weapons. no way to defend herself if it came to violence. Jacob seemed to read her thoughts. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a hunting knife in a leather sheath. "Here. I hope you will not need it, but better to have it just in case." She took the knife, feeling the weight of it in her hand. The blade was well maintained, sharp enough to be dangerous. She strapped it to her belt, drawing some comfort from the solid presence of the weapon. Jacob mounted up and pulled her behind him once more. "Let us see if we can lose them in the canyon country ahead. The terrain will favor us if we use it right." They rode hard for the next 2 hours, pushing into a maze of narrow canyons and twisted rock formations that rose like ancient sentinels from the desert floor. The paths between the rocks were barely wide enough for a horse, forcing them to slow down and pick their route carefully. Jacob navigated with confidence, taking turns that seemed random, but clearly followed some pattern he understood. The sun was past its peak when they heard the first shout behind them. Their pursuers had closed the distance, following them into the canyons. Jacob cursed under his breath and urged his horse faster, but the narrow paths limited their speed. Nayland looked back and caught a glimpse of riders rounding a bend about 300 yards behind. She recognized Carl Dixon's bulk even at that distance. "How many?" Jacob called over his shoulder. 4 men, all armed. Dixon is leading them." Jacob processed this information quickly, his mind clearly working through tactical options. He steered them into a side canyon that climbed upward through jumbled boulders. The path was treacherous, forcing the horse to scramble for footing, but it would be equally difficult for their pursuers. They emerged onto a plateau overlooking the canyon system. Jacob dismounted quickly and pulled Nalin down beside him. He tied his horse behind a large rock formation where it would be hidden from below, then drew both revolvers and checked that they were fully loaded. His movements were calm and practiced, the actions of a man who had been in similar situations many times before. "Listen carefully." Jacob's voice was steady, despite the danger closing in. "I am going to make a stand here. The high ground gives us an advantage, and the narrow approach means they can only come at us 1 or 2 at a time. I want you to stay behind these rocks no matter what happens. If something goes wrong, if I go down, you take my horse and ride north. Follow the sun until you reach the mountains, then head for the tallest peak. My cabin is on the eastern slope. You will find supplies there to survive." Nayland shook her head fiercely. "I will not abandon you. I can fight." Jacob grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You are unarmed, except for a knife, and you have been starved and beaten for months. You cannot fight 4 armed men and live. Please, do not make me worry about you while I am trying to keep us both alive. Trust me to handle this." Before she could argue further, the first rider appeared at the bottom of the trail leading up to the plateau. Carl Dixon sat astride a large roan horse, his face red with exertion and rage. 3 other men flanked him, rough-looking characters who likely worked on his ranch. They all carried rifles and pistols, weapons glinting in the afternoon sun. Dixon's voice boomed across the distance. "Kane, you son of a bitch. That savage belongs to me. I had the winning bid before you interfered. You are going to give her back and pay me for my trouble, or we are going to take her from your corpse." Jacob did not respond immediately. He positioned himself behind a boulder that provided cover while still allowing him to see the trail. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and hard. "She does not belong to anyone, Dixon. I paid for her freedom and she is free. Ride away now and nobody has to die today." Dixon laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "The hell I will. I came all this way and I am not leaving empty-handed. Boys, let us go teach this deserter a lesson about interfering in other men's business." The 4 riders started up the trail. Jacob waited until they were committed to the climb, unable to easily turn around on the narrow path, before he opened fire. His first shot hit one of Dixon's men in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The man screamed as he fell, tumbling down the rocky slope. The other riders scrambled for cover, firing wild shots that ricocheted off the boulders around Jacob's position. Nayland pressed herself against the rock, heart pounding as gunfire cracked through the air. She had witnessed battles before, had seen Apache warriors defend their villages against soldiers, but this was different. This violence was happening because of her, because she existed as a commodity these men wanted to possess. The guilt felt crushing, but she forced herself to focus. Jacob needed her alert, not paralyzed by shame. Jacob fired with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed. Another of Dixon's men went down, clutching his leg and dragging himself behind cover. The remaining 2, including Dixon, had taken positions behind rocks about 50 yards down the trail. They fired repeatedly at Jacob's position, forcing him to stay low. Bullets chipped away at his boulder, sending stone fragments flying. The exchange continued for several minutes, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Jacob's ammunition would not last forever, and Dixon had to know it. The rancher was content to pin them down and wait for an opening. Nayland watched Jacob reload his revolvers with practiced speed, his face showing no emotion beyond fierce concentration. Then Dixon tried a new tactic. While he and his remaining healthy companion kept up their covering fire, the man who had been shot in the leg began crawling around to the side, trying to flank their position. Nayland saw him moving through the rocks and grabbed Jacob's arm, pointing urgently. Jacob nodded his understanding and shifted his position slightly to cover both angles. The flanking maneuver failed when Jacob put a bullet through the man's hat, close enough to make him abandon the attempt and scramble back to cover. Dixon roared in frustration, realizing his numerical advantage was not enough to overcome Jacob's superior position and skill. The standoff continued as the sun slowly descended toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and red. Finally, Dixon made his move. He and his last able companion charged up the trail together, firing as they came and hoping to overwhelm Jacob through aggressive action. It was a desperate gamble born of frustration and anger rather than tactical thinking. Jacob stood from cover, both revolvers extended, and fired 4 times in rapid succession. Both charging men went down hard, Dixon clutching his chest while his companion collapsed face first onto the trail. The canyon fell silent except for the moaning of wounded men and the ringing in Nayland's ears from the gunfire. Jacob kept his weapons trained on the trail, watching for any further movement. After a full minute passed with no sign of continued threat, he carefully approached the downed men. Dixon was still alive, but barely, blood bubbling from his mouth as he struggled to breathe. His eyes found Nayland where she stood behind the rocks, filled with dying hatred. Jacob kicked Dixon's weapons away and checked the other fallen men. 2 were dead, 1 was unconscious from blood loss, and Dixon himself had only minutes left. The rancher tried to speak, but only managed a wet gurgle. Jacob knelt beside him, his expression unreadable. "You had a choice to ride away. You chose this." Dixon's eyes glazed over and his breathing stopped. Jacob stood and returned to Nayland, holstering his revolvers. She saw no satisfaction in his face, only weary acceptance. He had killed before and would kill again if necessary, but he took no pleasure in it. "We need to move now. Gunfire carries far in these canyons, and someone might investigate." Jacob gathered his horse and helped Nayland mount. They left the dead where they fell. Nature would claim them soon enough. As they rode away from the plateau, Nayland looked back one final time at Carl Dixon's corpse sprawled on the blood-stained rocks. He had viewed her as property to be owned, and that belief had cost him everything. They traveled through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the site of the gunfight. Jacob pushed hard despite the darkness, navigating by starlight and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Nayland clung to him, exhausted beyond measure, but unable to sleep in the saddle. Her mind replayed the violence over and over, analyzing every shot and scream. As dawn broke, they finally stopped near a small creek surrounded by cottonwood trees. Jacob's horse was near collapse from the sustained effort, foam flecking its mouth and flanks heaving. He tended to the animal first, walking it cool and giving it water gradually to prevent colic. Only after the horse was cared for did he allow himself to sit and rest. Nayland sat beside him, suddenly aware of how close she had come to death or worse. If Jacob had been a lesser shot, if Dixon had brought more men, if any number of small factors had shifted, she would be captive again or dead. The realization hit her with delayed force and she began to shake, adrenaline finally leaving her system. Jacob noticed her trembling and wrapped his coat around her shoulders without comment. They sat together as the sun rose, warming the creek valley and bringing life to the desert around them. Birds began to sing, unconcerned with human violence. The water burbled peacefully over smooth stones, eternal and indifferent. After a while, Nayland found her voice. You have killed many men." Again, it was not quite a question. Jacob stared at the creek, his scarred face reflecting something like sorrow. "More than I can count or want to remember. Some deserved it, some did not. I stopped trying to justify it years ago. I just try to make sure that when I do kill, it is for the right reasons." What are the right reasons? She genuinely wanted to know how he reconciled the violence with his quest for redemption. Jacob considered this for a long moment before answering. Protecting those who cannot protect themselves, stopping men who would do evil if left unchecked, self-defense when no other option remains. It is not much of a code, but it keeps me from becoming the monster I fought against in my army days. Nayland understood. She had seen her own warriors struggle with similar questions, forced to commit violence to defend their people while trying to maintain their humanity. There were no easy answers, no clean solutions. "You did the right thing yesterday," she said firmly. "Those men would have hurt us both if given the chance." Jacob nodded, but the sorrow did not leave his eyes. Knowing something is right does not make it easy to live with. They rested through the morning, both desperately needing sleep after the long night ride. Jacob kept watch for the first few hours while Nalin slept deeply, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. When she woke in the afternoon, she found him sleeping nearby, his revolvers within easy reach even in slumber. She kept watch while he rested, alert for any signs of pursuit or danger. When Jacob woke near sunset, they ate from his dwindling supplies and discussed their next move. "We are 2 days from my cabin now if we push hard. I do not think anyone else will follow us, but we should stay cautious." Nalin agreed. She felt safer with every mile they put between themselves and Dustfield, though she knew safety was always relative in this harsh land. As they prepared to ride again, Nalin stopped Jacob with a hand on his arm. "Thank you for fighting for me." "You did not have to risk your life, but you did anyway. I will not forget that." Jacob looked uncomfortable with her gratitude, clearly unused to being thanked. He shrugged awkwardly. "I told you before I am trying to balance the scales. You do not owe me thanks for doing what should have been done." Still, she wanted him to know that his actions mattered, that his redemption meant something to at least one person. They mounted up and continued north, riding through the gathering darkness toward the mountains that promised sanctuary. Nalin felt the first stirrings of hope, fragile and tentative, but real nonetheless. Perhaps there was a future beyond survival, beyond running and hiding. Perhaps with this strange, violent, honorable man, she could find a new purpose. The remaining journey to Jacob's cabin passed without incident. They saw no other travelers, no signs of pursuit. The land changed as they climbed into the mountains, leaving behind the harsh desert for forests of pine and aspen. The air grew cooler and cleaner, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. Nalin felt her spirit lifting with each mile, drawn to this mountain country that reminded her of the lands where her people had once hunted elk and gathered berries. On the afternoon of the third day, they reached the cabin. It sat in a small valley surrounded by towering pines, positioned where a stream tumbled down from the rocks above. The structure was solidly built from logs chinked with mud and moss, designed to withstand the brutal mountain winters. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and Nalin realized someone must be inside. Jacob tensed immediately, his hand moving to his revolver. He had not expected anyone to be here. They approached cautiously, Jacob scanning the tree line for signs of ambush. As they neared the cabin door, it swung open and a boy of perhaps 14 stepped out, rifle in hand. When he saw Jacob, his face split into a wide grin. "Jacob, you are back." I was starting to worry. The boy lowered his rifle and came forward to help with the horse. Jacob relaxed visibly, though surprise still showed on his weathered face. "Danny, what are you doing here? I thought you were working at the Mitchell Ranch." The boy shrugged as he took the horse's reins. "Old man Mitchell died last month. His son sold the ranch and cleared everyone out. I did not have anywhere else to go, so I came here. Hope you do not mind." Jacob dismounted and clasped the boy's shoulder in a gesture of affection. "You know you are always welcome." He helped Nalin down and made introductions. "Danny, this is Nalin. She will be staying with us for a while." "Nalin, this is Danny Carter. I have known him since he was half this size." Danny looked at Nalin with open curiosity, but no hostility. "Ma'am," he said politely, tipping his hat. Inside, the cabin was warm and surprisingly comfortable. A fire crackled in the hearth and the smell of cooking stew filled the air. Danny had clearly been maintaining the place in Jacob's absence, keeping it clean and well-stocked. The main room held a table, chairs, and a large bed in one corner. A ladder led to a loft where Danny apparently slept. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies, books, and various tools. Jacob showed Nalin to the bed, insisting she take it while he would sleep on the floor. She started to protest, but he cut her off firmly. "You have been through hell, and you need proper rest. I have slept on worse than a floor many times." Nalin was too tired to argue further. She sank onto the bed, which felt impossibly soft after weeks of hard ground and bare wooden platforms. Over dinner, Danny explained what had happened in the months since Jacob had last been home. The territory was getting more settled, more laws and more lawmen. Several wanted men had been captured or killed. There was talk of statehood within a few years. Jacob listened carefully, processing how these changes might affect his own precarious existence as a deserter with a price on his head. After Danny went up to the loft to sleep, Jacob and Nalin sat by the fire. She had been watching him with the boy, noting the gentle affection between them. "How did you meet Danny?" Jacob poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "Found him 3 years ago, half-starved and running from his stepfather, who used to beat him bloody. The man came after Danny, trying to drag him back. I convinced him that was a bad idea. Nolan could imagine how that conversation had gone. "You are a good man, Jacob Kane. You do not believe it about yourself, but it is true." Jacob looked at her with those gray eyes that had seen too much violence. "I have done terrible things, Nelind. Helping a few people does not erase that." She met his gaze steadily. "No, but it matters. Every life you save, every person you help, it matters. Your past does not have to define your future unless you let it." They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their different pasts. Jacob spoke more about his army days, the things he had witnessed and participated in that haunted him still. Nowlin told him about her childhood in the Apache camps, the traditions and skills her mother had taught her, the way her people had lived in harmony with the land before the endless wars began. They were both refugees from worlds that no longer existed, trying to build something new from the wreckage. As the fire burned down to coals, Nayland finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "What happens now? For me, I mean." Jacob considered this carefully before answering. "That is entirely up to you. You can stay here as long as you want or need. You can leave whenever you choose. This cabin can be a home or just a temporary shelter, whatever you decide. But you are free, Nalene. Truly free. Nobody owns you, nobody controls you. That includes me." The word settled over her like a benediction. Freedom was still a strange concept after months of captivity and a lifetime of seeing her people's freedom stripped away. But here, in this mountain cabin with this scarred man who had killed to protect her, she felt the first real stirrings of that freedom taking root. "I will stay for now. Learn this new way of living. Then perhaps I will know what I truly want." Jacob nodded his acceptance. "Fair enough." He stood and began arranging blankets on the floor near the hearth. Nowlin retired to the bed, sinking into the comfortable mattress with a sigh of relief. As she drifted towards sleep, she heard Jacob moving quietly around the cabin, checking the doors and windows one final time before settling down himself. That night, Nayland dreamed again of her mother. But this time, instead of warning her village about the coming soldiers, they were sitting together by a stream in the mountains, weaving baskets as they had done countless times before. Her mother looked at her and smiled, then spoke in their Apache tongue. "You have survived, daughter. Now you must learn to live." The dream felt like permission and guidance both, releasing her from survivor's guilt and pointing her toward whatever future awaited. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Danny was cooking breakfast while Jacob cleaned his revolvers at the table. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, painting everything in warm golden tones. Nalin rose and joined them, accepting a plate of food with genuine gratitude. For the first time in months, she ate without fear of what the next hour might bring. Over the following weeks, Nayland settled into the rhythm of cabin life. She proved herself immediately useful, bringing skills that both Jacob and Danny lacked. She could track game that they would have missed entirely, reading signs in the forest with expertise born from a lifetime of hunting. She knew which plants were edible and which were medicinal, gathering herbs that she dried and stored for winter use. She tanned the hides from their hunts into supple leather, creating moccasins and clothing far superior to anything they had worn before. Jacob watched her work with quiet respect, never interfering or offering unwanted advice. He understood that she needed to contribute, that sitting idle would have been torture for someone who had survived through constant adaptation and skill. Danny followed her around like a devoted puppy, eager to learn everything she could teach. She showed him how to move silently through the forest, how to read weather signs in the clouds, how to find water in seemingly dry terrain. The mountain valley became a haven for all three of them. Jacob continued to struggle with his demons, but the presence of Nayland and Danny seemed to give him something to fight for beyond abstract redemption. He taught them both to shoot properly, insisting they could defend themselves if danger ever came to the cabin. Nayland proved to be a natural marksman, her hunting skills translating well to firearms once she understood the mechanics. As autumn deepened and the aspen leaves turned gold, they worked together to prepare for winter. Wood was cut and stacked until the pile towered against the cabin wall. Game was hunted and smoked, filling the small root cellar with preserved meat. Nayland showed them how to make pemmican, mixing dried meat with fat and berries to create food that would last for months. They repaired the roof, reinforced the chimney, and ensured every crack in the walls was properly sealed against the coming cold. One evening in late October, as the first snow began to fall, they sat around the fire sharing stories. Annie had just finished recounting a humorous mishap from his day of fishing when he turned to Nowlin with curiosity bright in his eyes. "Will you tell us an Apache story? Something from your people?" Nowlin hesitated, feeling the old grief rise up. But both Jacob and Danny watched her with such genuine interest that she found herself nodding. She told them the story of Child of the Water, the Apache hero who slayed monsters and made the world safe for humans. She spoke of changing woman who created the first people and taught them how to live. The words came haltingly at first, rusty from disuse, but soon flowed smoothly as she remembered her grandmother's voice telling these same stories around different fires in a world that seemed impossibly distant now. Jacob and Danny listened in respectful silence, understanding they were being given something precious. When she finished, Danny thanked her enthusiastically while Jacob simply nodded his appreciation. But Nowlin saw something shift in Jacob's eyes, a recognition of what she had lost and the courage it took to share it. That night marked a turning point. The cabin truly became home rather than just shelter, and the three of them truly became family rather than just survivors sharing space. Winter arrived with ferocious intensity, burying the valley under feet of snow and bringing temperatures cold enough to freeze water solid within minutes. They were trapped in the cabin for days at a time during the worst storms, huddled near the fire and rationing their supplies carefully. But there was warmth in their confinement, a sense of safety that Nowlin had not experienced since childhood. During those long winter nights, Jacob opened up more about his past. He spoke of the daughter he had left behind when he deserted, a girl who would be a woman now and who probably thought her father was dead or a coward. He talked about the friends he had lost in the war, good men ground up by the machinery of expansion and conquest. Naylin listened and shared her own losses in return, the two of them bonding over shared grief and survivor's guilt. Danny provided moments of levity, his youthful energy refusing to be dampened by the harsh weather. He carved elaborate figures from wood, played harmonica with increasing skill, and generally kept their spirits up when cabin fever threatened to make them all irritable. He had become the heart of their small family, the innocent center around which two damaged adults orbited. Spring arrived gradually, the snow melting to reveal a valley transformed by wildflowers and new grass. The stream, frozen solid for months, burst back to life with rushing meltwater. Animals emerged from hibernation, and migrating birds returned to the mountains. It felt like a rebirth, and Naylin experienced it as such. She had survived another winter, but more than that, she had found a place where she belonged. One April morning, Jacob announced he needed to ride down to the settlement to trade for supplies they could not produce themselves. Nowlin immediately said she would go with him. He looked uncertain, clearly worried about exposing her to potential danger, but she insisted, "I cannot hide forever. I need to learn how to exist in this world, not just in our valley." Jacob recognized the truth in this and agreed, though he made her promise to stay close and let him do the talking. They rode down from the mountains together, leaving Danny to maintain the cabin. The settlement was a rough collection of buildings that could not quite be called a town, a trading post where trappers and miners came to exchange their goods for necessities. Jacob had been coming here for years and had established tentative trust with the proprietor, an older man named George who asked few questions. Nowlin felt the stares as they entered the trading post. Her Apache heritage was obvious in her features and the traditional elements she had incorporated into her clothing. But Jacob's presence beside her seemed to provide protection, his reputation as a dangerous man preceding him. George greeted them cordially and conducted business without comment on Nowlin's presence, though his eyes showed curiosity. They were loading their purchased supplies onto the horse when trouble found them. Three men emerged from the rough saloon across the street, clearly drunk despite the early hour. One of them pointed at Nowlin and said something to his companions that made them laugh. Jacob tensed immediately, his hand dropping near his revolver in an unconscious gesture. The three men approached, swaggering with alcohol-fueled confidence. The one who had pointed spoke first, his words slurred but his intent clear. "Well now, Kane, I heard you had yourself a squaw up in those mountains. Did not believe it till now. How much for a turn with her?" His companions laughed again, clearly expecting Jacob to either join in the crude humor or back down from confrontation. Jacob's voice when he spoke was flat and cold as winter stone. "Walk away. Now." The drunk man seemed taken aback by the intensity of Jacob's response. He had expected banter, not a death threat delivered with absolute sincerity. "Come on now, I am just having a bit of fun. No need to get all serious about a savage." He never saw Jacob move. One moment Jacob was standing still, the next his fist connected with the drunk's jaw, dropping him instantly. The man's companions reached for their weapons, but froze when they found themselves staring down the barrels of Jacob's revolvers, drawn with supernatural speed. "Touch those guns and you die right here." Jacob's voice carried across the street, drawing attention from everyone in the settlement. The two standing men slowly raised their hands, suddenly very sober. Their friend groaned on the ground, spitting blood and a broken tooth. Jacob kept his weapons trained on them as he spoke to the growing crowd. "Listen well. This woman is under my protection. Anyone who disrespects her, anyone who threatens her, anyone who even looks at her wrong will answer to me personally. I have killed better men than you for less cause. Test me if you doubt my sincerity." The crowd dispersed quickly, wanting no part of Jacob Kane's wrath. George watched from his trading post doorway, nodding approval. Jacob holstered his revolvers and helped Nalin onto the horse, then swung up behind her. As they rode out of the settlement, Nalin felt a complex mix of emotions. "You did not have to do that." "I have heard worse insults." Jacob's reply was immediate and fierce. "You should not have to hear them at all. You deserve respect and dignity, and I will fight anyone who thinks otherwise." Nalin felt something warm bloom in her chest, an emotion she was afraid to name. This man who had freed her, who had killed for her, who now defended her honor against drunk fools, he had become more than just a protector or friend. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, both of them processing what had happened. When they arrived, Danny greeted them enthusiastically, eager to hear about their trip. Jacob recounted the incident with typical understatement while Danny listened wide-eyed. "You really dropped him with one punch?" Jacob shrugged. He had a glass jaw, and I had motivation. Nalin hid her smile at Jacob's modest description of his own violence. That night, after Danny had gone to sleep in the loft, Nalin and Jacob sat by the fire as had become their custom. She had been thinking all day about what she wanted to say, trying to find the right words in English to express feelings that were easier in her own language. Finally, she simply spoke from the heart. "Jacob Kane, you freed me from chains I could see, and then helped me break chains I could not see. You have given me a home, a family, a future I never thought I would have. I do not know what tomorrow brings, but I know I want to face it here, with you and Danny, if you will have me." Jacob looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the Apache woman to the person beneath. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "Nalin, having you here has changed something in me. I thought redemption was a solitary path, a long road I would walk alone until death finally claimed me. But you have shown me that redemption can also mean building something new, creating rather than just destroying. I want you to stay, not because I saved you, but because you make this place feel like home rather than just a hiding spot." He paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "I care about you more than I probably should, more than is wise for a man like me." Nalin crossed the space between them and took his scarred hand in hers. "Then be unwise with me. We have both lost everything. Maybe it is time we found something new together." Jacob squeezed her hand, and in that simple gesture, Nalin felt years of walls and defenses beginning to crumble. They sat together in comfortable silence as the fire burned low, two wounded souls beginning the slow process of healing each other. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. Jacob, Nalin, and Danny became a family bound not by blood, but by choice and circumstance. They built additions to the cabin as Danny grew into a young man and eventually brought home a wife of his own. Nalin's knowledge of the land, combined with Jacob's tactical mind and Danny's enthusiasm, made them successful hunters and trappers, prosperous enough to live comfortably if simply. Nalin never forgot her people or her heritage. She kept their stories alive, teaching them to Danny's children and anyone else who would listen. She created beautiful beadwork and quill work that became sought after in the settlements, bringing in additional income while preserving her culture. Sometimes she dreamed of the reservation where her family had been taken, wondering if any of them still lived. But she never made the journey. Her life was here now, in these mountains, with this makeshift family. Jacob gradually came to terms with his past, though the guilt never fully left him. He helped other fugitives and outcasts when he could, extending to them the same redemption he had offered Nalin. Word spread quietly through the underground networks of desperate people that there was a cabin in the mountains where the dangerous and unwanted could find temporary sanctuary. Jacob never turned anyone away who came seeking help, though he made it clear they had to earn their keep and respect everyone under his protection. As they aged together, Jacob and Nalin's relationship deepened into something neither could quite articulate, but both understood completely. They were partners in every sense, equals who had chosen each other despite, or perhaps because of their respective traumas. On quiet evenings, they would sit together and remember everything they had survived, grateful for the improbable path that had brought them to this moment. Danny became a successful man in his own right, eventually taking over management of their holdings when Jacob's reflexes slowed and his aim became less certain. But he never forgot the two people who had saved him, who had shown him what family really meant. He named his first daughter Nalin in honor of the Apache woman who had become his mother in all ways that mattered. The world continued to change around them. The territory became a state. Railroads pushed through the mountains. What had once been wild frontier became settled land with laws and schools and churches. The old ways died hard, but they died. Jacob's past as a deserter became irrelevant as most of the men who would have cared grew old or died. He was just another pioneer who had carved out a life in difficult country. Nalin watched her people's final struggles from a distance, reading about the last Apache campaigns in newspapers that took weeks to reach their mountain valley. When Geronimo finally surrendered in 1886, she felt a bone-deep sorrow for the end of an era. She was truly the last free Apache woman, the only one who had escaped both the reservation and assimilation through a combination of luck and violence. But she had also found something her people never could have, a synthesis of the old ways and the new world. She lived by Apache values of strength, resourcefulness, and connection to the land while existing in a settler society that had tried to erase her people. It was not a perfect balance, and the compromises sometimes felt like betrayals. But she had survived and even thrived in her own way. One autumn evening, many years after that auction in Dustfield, Nayland and Jacob sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Both were gray-haired now, their bodies bearing the marks of hard lives and harder choices. Danny's grandchildren played in the yard, a mix of backgrounds and bloodlines that would have been impossible in an earlier era. Jacob broke the comfortable silence with a question he had never asked before. "Do you ever regret it? Coming with me that day instead of running?" Nalin considered this seriously, giving the question the weight it deserved. Then she shook her head slowly. "No regrets. You gave me freedom when I had none. I chose to use that freedom to stay with you. That choice has made all the difference." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "Do you regret spending $100 on a stranger?" Jacob laughed, a sound that came more easily now than it had in earlier years. "Best money I ever spent. You saved my life as much as I saved yours, you know. I was dying inside before you came along, just going through motions and waiting for my past to catch up with me. You reminded me that redemption is not about paying off debts, but about choosing to be better every single day." They sat together as darkness fell, and the stars emerged one by one in the mountain sky. Somewhere in those stars, Nayland believed, her mother and all her lost relatives watched over her. She hoped they approved of the path she had chosen, the life she had built from the ashes of everything they had lost. She hoped they understood that survival sometimes meant adaptation, and that preserving their memory did not require dying with them. Inside the cabin, Danny called them in for dinner. Jacob stood with a grunt, his knees protesting age and old injuries. He offered his hand to Nayland and pulled her to her feet with the same careful courtesy he had shown on that auction platform so many years ago. They walked inside together, leaving the wild mountains to the night, to find warmth and family and the future they had earned through suffering and choice. The last Apache woman on the auction block had found her freedom not through escape or resistance, but through the unexpected compassion of a stranger who became something far more important. She had survived, she had lived, and she had chosen her own path. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all.